So this video is to give you some tips for how to study for biology exams, specifically my exams, but I think these skills will help you in any biology class and probably other classes as well in college. So the conversation that I have with a lot of students after they don't do very well after the first exam is that they tell me that they studied a lot, which I interpret that to mean they spent time. They spent a lot, what they feel is a lot of time, and yet when they got to the test, they didn't do very well. And so I typically try to break down for them, or to have them break down for me, what exactly the problem is. So for example, did you study according to the schedule? Because I set out a schedule and instructors set out a schedule, maybe every week there's a chapter. I also give tutorials, and sometimes there's little worksheets, sometimes there's an extra video, but whatever those materials are, they're scheduled out. So you can't wait till the end. That's the first thing. Sometimes students say yes, they waited until the end and they didn't have enough time really. And so that's the first thing. So as long as you're on the schedule, keeping up with the schedule, then I ask them, what do they mean when they say they studied? And typically what I get, the answer I get from students who didn't do very well on the exam is they said they read it. Maybe they read the book chapter, maybe they went over, they say I went over the slides, I went over my notes, and what they're talking about is reading. So they're looking at it in front of their face, and when you're looking at something in front of your face, you feel like you know it. I could have a list of phone numbers and I could look at it for a long time, and I start to feel like I know it because it's right here. But there's something in learning theory that you may not be aware of, and so I wanted to share something that I know. I'm not trying to teach you all of learning theory. I certainly am not qualified to do that. But one thing I know from learning theory, I'm showing you this model here. There's a lot of models for learning theory, but this one I think is simple enough that it's going to make sense for everyone. When you first read or hear something, that's the very beginning of the learning process, and that on this picture is on the far left-hand side, of the screen. And so it's sensory information. You're hearing, you're seeing, you're reading, you may be speaking something, you're paying attention to it, and it goes into the part of your brain called the register, all right? And that's just the very beginning. And then sometimes you read over and keep reading over and looking over, but you're really not getting past this, I guess, second block on this scheme. If you may be getting some things into short-term memory, but not nearly enough. And the other thing is your short-term memory is a real bottleneck, so it can only take so much information at once. So if you're studying right at the end, the day before the test, it's just not enough room in your short-term memory to keep everything. So what you have to do is read, study, look at things according to the course schedule. And here's where I think the piece that most students miss. I want you to think of all the material I've given you as the answers to the test questions. I've given you all the answers, but I'm not giving you the questions, which is kind of weird. Sometimes there are some questions that you can practice. I might give you a little worksheet or a little something, but I'm not giving you all the test questions. So what you have to do is come up with what the test questions are going to be. So you can go over any, if there was like a little worksheet or a practice quiz, maybe you could print out a copy that's blank and redo it. See if you can do it without looking at your notes. See if you can look at every slide, including the information from the lecture, and say, these are the answers to the questions, but what are the questions? So if on the slide there's a definition for a gametophyte plant, a gametophyte plant is a multicellular plant made out of haploid cells in the alternation of generations life cycle that produces the gametes for that sexual life cycle. And so that might all be on the slide. But what you need to do is then, maybe on a note card, write a question. Define gametophyte plant. Maybe that's the question. More of a statement, but define gametophyte plant. And then eventually you can take those note cards and you should be able to define gametophyte plant without peeking back at your notes. Because when you're looking at your notes, you're like, yeah, I know what it is. But it's different when you have the question, define gametophyte plant, or explain what a gametophyte plant is. Can you do it from your brain? Eventually you need to be able to do that. And that's this second part of this model, where you take things from short-term memory and you move them into long-term memory. And really the only way to do that is through constant retrieval, repeated retrieval, and the rehearsal loop. You can see those things here. You have to keep bringing them back. You have to keep using those note cards, and maybe the next day, can I still define gametophyte plant? And the next day. And you're adding on to your list of questions too, as you're adding more information. And so eventually you have this, maybe could be on a piece of paper, but maybe a stack of cards that just has questions. Can you answer all of them from memory without looking back at your notes? That's your goal eventually. So you keep working on that until you can do that to some level of near perfection. And then if you really want to go one more step, find somebody else in the class that's been doing that same activity, writing questions that go along with the slides and the lecture, and they'll have written their questions. They'll probably be pretty similar, but maybe some with some different wording. And practice, can you answer their questions when the wording is a little different? But that's a skill, to be able to create your own test in a way and be able to answer all those questions. I bet you're going to find that 80% of the questions on the actual exam will be very similar to the questions that you practiced, or they'll be close enough that you'll be able to retrieve the information you need to answer your instructor's questions. So it's the second part. Looking and reading at something is the first part, but that just gets you into the sensory register. That just gets you from what we call familiarizes you with the material. But being familiar isn't enough. Not in college. In college, you have to take that and start creating open-ended questions. You could really create multiple choice questions if you really wanted to do that. True-false questions are appropriate sometimes. And then eventually you're just looking at those questions without your notes, and can you come up with the right answers with no help? By the time you get to the test, it's very difficult for the instructor to come up with other questions that you wouldn't have already prepared for. And even if she does come up with a few that are a little bit harder, you will have enough knowledge in your working memory, in your long-term memory, that you can solve whatever she throws at you. All right, so that's my advice. All right, don't just become familiar with the material. Do that first, but then start creating practice questions, and make sure you can answer your own practice questions without peeking at your notes, and then working with a partner or a couple partners, maybe a couple days before the exam itself, can really firm it up even better. So that's something I wanted to share with you. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, you may realize that you're only getting to the familiar stage of learning, but you're not getting to the repeated retrieval stage of learning. And that's what you really need to get things into your long-term memory.